I'm speaking with Sarah McFarland, author of Ecocollapse, Fiction and Cultures of Human Extinction, published January 28th, 2021 by Bloomsbury Academic. Thank you for speaking with me.
Thank you for inviting me, Cris.
So, first, how did you get into studying and writing this very specific subject about this subject?
So, I have my entire scholarly career has been trying to answer the question of what does it mean to be human and who is included and excluded. So my early work was in looking at non-human animals and the sort of construction of these binaries and oppositions that included and excluded certain types of beings into who we grant sort of space for, compassion for, sympathy for. And this book kind of turns that inside out in a way. And so what I was looking at now was more the ways that humans try to exclude themselves from the consequences that species worldwide are facing right now. There is a mass extinction event happening. This is incontrovertible. And so it started for me with Cormac McCarthy's The Road.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, of course, a post-apocalyptic, devastated landscape where a man and a boy are on a journey seeking some different kind of future. And that's completely unrealistic for them. And I was really stunned by the critical response to this text because I found so many people were talking about it as, this wonderful love story of support. And I'm appalled going, the mother is attacked. So in the scholarly literature, she was called a bad mother for abandoning her child when she goes off to the side one day and kills herself with a piece of obsidian. As I point out, she selflessly left the few bullets for the father and the boy. But this is a landscape where nothing grows. There's marauders. There's, people are eating each other. There is no possible recreation of society.
Mm-hmm.
And my empathetic intelligibility was with the mother. And so I was kind of trying to figure out, what is everyone else seeing here when she was right? She had said in the novel that you will abandon him at the end. And the father makes all these promises. I will never leave you. I will never leave you. And at the end, he dies and leaves the boy alone in this same exact horrorscape that they had been in the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I was trying to figure out was why? What is that fundamental motivation behind, as readers and as authors, this desire for redemptive endings, where people were reading this novel and finding, assuming the boy was going to be okay, when every bit of evidence, textual evidence in the novel is the boy is not going to be okay. There is no okay about what is happening in this world. And it's the father who really revealed to me, because he's so convinced that his son carries the fire, is the phrase that's repeated through the novel. And that somehow makes him an exception to the reality of the world they're living in. And so they're struggling on this dangerous, unending, hopeless journey. And I wanted to figure out, why are there these good guys and bad guys? And that's such a typical post-apocalyptic trope, right? You see in almost every post-apocalyptic novel.
Mm-hmm.
And then I wanted to figure out what it meant. What does it mean that we can't face the potentiality of our own, not insufficiency, but our own lack of being special as a species and as individuals. And so the book developed out of that.
Okay. Yeah, that's That's pretty fascinating. So then how do you lay out the book? What do you focus on? Do you look at different works or?
Yeah, so I mean, what I do is read, right,
Mhm,
as a literature scholar. So I got to read widely, which is wonderful. But I found that within the Western tradition, which is the very tradition that invented extractive capitalism, that has resulted in anthropogenic climate change, that tradition really privileges the individual and the human,
mhm,
and that individual is excluded from consequences, is elevated to a narrative kind of untouchability.
mhm,
And so I had to first figure out how to break down anthropocentrism with careful, close readings of text. And so the body chapters, rather than like one example, another example, a third example, they really build on each other. Um, so I first work through those hierarchical proclivities and the ways that they construct the anthropocentric subject
mhm,
to explore how subjective entanglement in the world can be a way for us to sort of have species humility, to recognize our animal beings, our animal vulnerabilities.
mhm,
And then I developed the stages of what I call ecocollapse and the adaptations that characters undergo in two stages, I argue, of the ecocollapse itself. So Helen
mhm,
Simpson's Diary of an Interesting Year is a really short story, but it's sort of like the beginnings. They try geoengineering, everything goes wrong. And, we see climate refugees, we see some of the earlier stages of that process. And then McCarthy's The Road
mhm,
as sort of the end stage, right? Everything's dead. If nothing grows, people eat each other. That's all that's left.
mhm,
Um, there is no recreation of society. And then I do a close reading of Peter Heller's The Dog Stars,
mhm,
which I argue really subtly depicts an inevitable extinction by means of the narrator's report that he's the last witness.
mhm,
And he's reporting like he's writing in a sort of therapeutic way for himself the
mhm,
loss and loneliness that he experienced in this post-pandemic climate changed environment.
mhm.
So it creates this overarching case from within the perils of our planet's present climate crisis for some. I mean, there's people already dealing with the effects of climate change every day.
Mhm.
And then the global near future for everyone.
So the works that you look at, can they all be classified as science fiction to some extent?
So no, I mean, this is where we get into those, like, how do we define the genre?
Mhm,
I purposefully excluded works that didn't include that had some dependence on technology as not yet in practice.
mm,
Um,
okay.
and so, I mean, in terms of their like geoengineering is happening now.
Mhm,
So I was really looking for that's why I called it realistic
mhm,
speculative fiction.
yeah,
I avoided what would be traditionally part of the science fiction genre.
hmm,
Um,
okay. Because one work I thought of, whether it could fit in what you're looking at or not, is, say, something like I Am Legend, where you have, I don't know if you're familiar with it.
yeah.
It's not quite, the Earth isn't dying, but the human species is pretty much dead. So that's sort of where I was going with that question.
Yeah, and that might actually be one of the places I turn to next because I love science fiction. I read a lot of science fiction, um, but for this particular book, I chose not to include it for a couple of reasons. We think of climate change as needing a solution based on intelligence, when
Mhm,
intelligence is what created the very
uh,
structural inequalities and extractive capitalism that got us the Anthropocene in the first place, right? So there was
mhm,
something about that I felt like we can't seek solutions like that if we're trying to create a sort of intelligibility about what it feels like to go extinct. There can't be a Mars colony. There can't be, space colonization to protect, to like let us escape the consequences of these choices that,
Right.
but also not everyone's Elon Musk. Like, even if that happens, 99.9% of us are not going to have access to those kinds of escape pods. And what happens to the rest of us and the countless other species on Earth? And I find it fascinating. Like, right now, people are talking about creating caches of genetic material on the moon. And I'm thinking to myself, like, what is it being saved for? What is this? They're calling it like Noah's Ark the second. It's through the University of Arizona. I don't know if you've heard about this.
No.
But I'm like, what is it? What are we going to do? Like, if we destroy the ecosystems in which we and all the species around us evolved, having genetic material on the moon doesn't resolve the problem. But I also excluded sci-fi because even the hard sci-fi tends to discount or ignore our body materiality in important ways. So, like, the human gut microbiome, for example, has significant effects on our health, on our immunity to disease, even mental well-being. And what happens, like space travel, do they ever talk about how they're going to, how the people traveling are going to maintain a healthy microbiome? Are there, I don't see that in a lot of the texts, right? They sort of skip over that as though it's just a shift in location and a shift in, without the like reduced cognitive function that occurs after 60 days of tilt bed rest, or what happens with chronic neutron radiation in space, or the psychological effects of living in static environments. And so there's so much we don't yet know that I really wanted to focus on what happens if we can't escape from the Earth in the first place. Like, what happens and what does it feel like, and how can we use that power of the humanities to help push this, more success in the sciences toward climate mitigation.
I'm speaking with Sarah McFarland, author of Ecocollapse, Fiction and Cultures of Human Extinction. You can find more information about the book on the Bloomsbury Academic webpage. If you like this episode so far, please like it and consider subscribing. All of my links can be heard at the end of this episode. Now back to the video. Yeah, when you mention sort of the idea of the flame, what comes to mind is sort of it's like a religious idea, that the human beings will always fight to survive and strive, but then there's also, I think, I don't know if humanism is the right sort of secular analog, or, there's also an idea, even among non-religious people, like we'll reach for the stars and expand and always grow. And, it's, so I'm just curious if you have comments about that.
Well, that's the human exceptionalism that I think pervades this. Like, it's just not going to happen to us, and progressivism comes out of that, this idea that we can make progress toward some better goal, and that reach for the stars. And I'll admit, I love the idea. Like, did you not watch Perseverance land on Mars and get a little emotional? And when you realize that the parachute had a message in it, and like, that is awe-inspiring. But there are people today who are dealing on Earth with real consequences. We have droughts, we have we're not calling them climate refugees, but a lot of people are having to leave their traditional home spaces because they're no longer suitable for habitation.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm in Louisiana. We had 2 snowstorms that took out in this January and February. We were without water, power, electricity, the whole thing for day. Texas got the press rightfully. They had a much worse situation, but it's happening everywhere now. The fires in Australia and California. So yes, I love that reach for the stars.
Mm-hmm.
I love, dream great things. But at the same time, we need to remember that there are billions of people on this planet that are being affected today, and uncountable other species that are going extinct.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it always, I don't know if there's a word or some kind of theory that talks about it, but it feels like, there's a segment of humanity that just keeps pushing forward and almost doesn't, I don't want to say they don't care about the ones that are left behind, but they don't worry about it. It's almost like this idea, if we move forward, the rest will, maybe slower than us, but the rest will follow. And in the end, but still leaving a lot of casualties behind.
Yeah. And those casualties are our lives.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of why I thought it was so important to really carefully unpack these examples in such a way to give that empathetic intelligibility to what that experience feels like.
Mm-hmm.
Because for many of us, I'm living in a high carbon society. I'm privileged in uncountable ways. So what does that feel like? And how can that help affect change? Because this isn't just a matter of, climate solutions and climate mitigation are not just a matter of, the extractive oil and gas industry saying, what are you going to do to limit climate change? As though what comes out of our tailpipes is different. What needs to change is structurally, is a political, structural, social, economic transformation that can't happen at the level of the individual to affect any meaningful corrections.
Did you come across any works either that you discussed in your book, or maybe you weren't able to put them in for whatever reason, that do more than just look at it, but also provide some sort of better approach? And I'm sorry if you already said so, but
I think, better approach. What I found was that the genre itself, and I think the way that plot structures work, have really limited in some ways the way that creative writers can imagine a different kind of outcome. So what I found instead of lots of like alternatives was this pattern of, some massive apocalyptic event that oftentimes, cleared out some of the population, which is convenient, and there's less fighting, right? But in any case, there's this us-them binary, the good guys and the bad guys. There's tribalisms that are constructed. Morality is, really fluid. It stops having a lot of clear cut what's good and what's bad, as much as they're trying to sort of dictate we're good and they're bad. And then often these sort of pastoral recreation of a new society. And often that's signaled with reproductive futurity, where at the ending there's a pregnancy or a child or something, which, gives everybody the sense that things will be okay, right? That there will be a future. And that's part of why it was so challenging to find texts that I found doing something different. That pattern is so deeply ingrained that you need to have that plot structure that we talk about in literature classes, you know, where you sort of have this, here's your intro, there's rising action, there's a climax, falling action, and resolution. And that resolution is so tempting to make happy.
Have you seen, so it seems like to find anyone or any author who's tried something different, it's almost like you have to look to experimental literature, you know, that hasn't been widely published to find an alternative approach or look at this.
Yeah. And I think there are texts that do different things, but they didn't fit within my, I want it to be realistic with the definition that I gave, right? I'm thinking of Jemison, for example, with the Earth trilogy, and where what we have the literal moving of geology with the mind. And so those are things that are so far outside of like realistic solutions to climate problems today. They're about empowering the disempowered, and, you know, how materiality and agency intersect in different ways. But it's hard to imagine a future. Although I'll say climate fiction is now, I mean, there's very few novels and short stories coming out that don't have some aspect of climate change in them today. And I think that's something, you know, that acceptance of it as a reality. It's kind of we had the nuclear war fears, you know, we had the Cold War fears that came out in all the fiction, the post-apocalyptic fiction of that time period. And climate change is definitely the one, I think, of this generation.
Something you were saying about, just a few minutes ago when you were talking about sort of the patterns of how dramatic, you know, patterns of how drama is used in literature and in other forms of entertainment. It makes me think, in a sense, maybe humankind might not have, philosophically, ethically, might not have, as a whole, might not have the capacity to face real dread, you know, and handle it and do the right thing. It might be that maybe we're stuck just always trying to look at the bright side and not, you know, and not facing the dark side well enough, and then it's just going to lead to you know, the consequences that we seem to be headed for.
Yeah, you know, climate change has been called a super wicked problem because it's so complicated and there's so many different threads to it that you can't just pick one thing and say, oh, we'll fix this, you know, or we'll fix this. And so it's a super wicked problem. And I think part of that is that you're right. We're psychologically we've evolved to assume tomorrow will be much like today was, which is much like yesterday. And to conceptualize something that's so, like, how do you imagine 3 degrees of warming or rising water or acidified oceans or, you know, the bees? Like, you can say the bees are in trouble, and you can tell people that means that our agriculture is in trouble, but they can still go to the store, right? It still seems okay. So it's really hard to, I mean, it's this vague, amorphous threat rather than, you know, the nuclear. I mean, I grew up where we had the bomb, you know, we had the bomb stuff and had to get under the desk where, you know, in school. And that felt real. Like the Russians could get us at any time, right?
Yeah.
I'm not sure what the desk would have helped with, frankly, but, you know.
Was it lead lined?
I mean, I grew up in Los Angeles, and so, you know, we had various alarms that went off, and we did train, but I do remember holding onto the legs of my desk from underneath, wondering, like, I guess it was safe, but
Yeah,
that's the other thing too, right? Though, wasn't that really about making us feel like we had a plan?
mm-hmm.
That the kids would be calmer, the parents would be more reassured, the teachers had something to do, if this then that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the problem with this is there's nothing you or I as individuals can do to really meaningfully change anything.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying you shouldn't, do everything you can, but the truth is that this is a deeply systemic problem
Mm-hmm.
that no amount of bicycle riding or veganism or planting clover in your yard for the bees is going to solve. It's outside of our control in that sense.
One thing that suddenly came into mind, and again, I'm sorry if you already kind of discussed this earlier, but Noah's Ark and the biblical flood, it feels like our society has somewhat kind of a love affair with the cleansing idea, like something, and in a sense, apocalyptic literature seems to be, yes, it's horrible, but it's also cleansing, and those who can survive will carry forth, quote, the flame. So part of me wonders how much people just are like, we're back to, we'll be okay. Yeah, we'll cleanse out the system, but good and strong people will be left behind or left to continue.
Yeah. And that's one of you're right. I mean, some of our earliest literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh, right, has a flood narrative. It's that it's almost like we want to destroy the world to have a new start because maybe they'll do it better.
Mm-hmm.
That's absolutely a pattern in this kind of fiction. And I think that's why it was so important to find those texts that didn't have that happy ending. That as much as I don't want it to be, despairing. I don't want, my readers to finish the book and be despairing. Mm-hmm. And that's part of why I really worked in the conclusion to focus on the adaptations that the characters developed that demonstrated, community defiance and resilience and agency. Even as I didn't want to undo the power of that extinction, of that last witness writing what it was to be the last human being on the planet. Mm-hmm. In hopes that seductive quality of rebuilding might not happen at the end of this book, at least. Mm-hmm. I think we need to face that. There's billions of people on this planet. Nobody really talks about what happened to those who were drowned mm-hmm. in Noah's, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, the victims are, they deserved it, or they were unfortunate victims, and we can move on.
Right. As long as it's not me.
Yeah.
I'm the individual. I want to survive. I mean, that's one of the things that came out of this research, was realizing, it isn't the strong or the smart or the brave who survive. It's the people who are cowards in the face of death, of being unwilling to accept that death is the one absolute leveler mm-hmm. of all life on earth, right? And so these characters would construct these sort of moral and ethical codes so that they could maintain a sense of righteousness, that were obviously, fuzzy and adaptable in situations. I mean, the same way that people rationalize their behavior in lots of other kinds of situations, you know, but so the good guys always come out on top, right?
Yeah. But then that also makes me think about the idea. One thing I sort of semi-privately rail against when I can, or the idea of superheroes, you know, people looking to superheroes, you know, saving the day, or people identifying as superheroes, like, you know, I'll be stronger than everyone else or smarter and I can survive and win, you know, whereas the fact is most people, you know, don't have the ability, you know, they're not superhuman. Well, not most, all people, no one's a superhuman, but I guess ultimately entertainment that kind of says, don't worry, you know, there'll be some kind of heroic way to save everything. It kind of bothers me in a sense because it needs simple people to find a solution.
Yeah. Well, I think the most pernicious narrative is the hero's quest. And, you know, it tends to be full of violence, and it always has the hero's rewarded, right? But, you know, I think that's part of what I was trying to turn away from too, and to challenge the ways that isn't a reasonable outcome for the climate chaos and violence and genocide and biodiversity loss and the resource conflicts. I mean, the US government has a military division that is examining all the ways in which resource conflicts are a threat to homeland security. At the same time that we've had administrations denying that climate change is real. You know, there's every expectation is even greater political and social upheaval, you know, mass human and non-human migrations, deaths, extinctions, and, you know, all of these sufferings are racialized and sexualized and differently situated in ways that it's really important that we think about. And, you know, the consequences of climate change hit hardest on those people who are least responsible for things like carbon emissions. And that puts us back at that top again, right? So it's Western tradition, human exceptionalism, top of the hierarchy again. And that, I think, is just wrong. That we need to destroy that sense of superiority, that we're the survivors. They say, you know, if you have everything you need, make a bigger table, right? Invite more in. And we need to think about the ways that our circles of influence can affect change for more people.
I'm speaking with Sarah McFarland, author of Ecocollapse, Fiction and Cultures of Human Extinction. You can find more information about the book on the Bloomsbury Academic webpage. If you like this episode so far, please like it and consider subscribing. All of my links can be heard at the end of this episode. Now back to the video. So I'm going to ask a question that might seem blasphemous in the world of literary studies, but does literature, does the stuff that talks about this, does it really, do you think it really reflects society in any way? Is it just fun? And in the end of the day, people are going to act totally differently, totally, you know, like, is it really part of society or not, the literature?
So, so you're being this blasphemy. I'm going to think about this. I have been, you know, teaching at university for more than 2 decades. And I firmly believe, perhaps because I need to, but I firmly believe that reading about diverse experiences and situating yourself as a reader within those experiences of your protagonist, of your narrator, however it's contextualized in the text, opens our eyes to realities that otherwise we wouldn't necessarily have access to at all or know exist. And I mean, there's no way to experience the world. I mean, you want to talk about time travel? The only way that you can time travel is reading a book.
Yeah.
You know, the only way. I mean, it's like, so I need to believe that the humanities have the power, what's called that empathetic intelligibility, that you sit through a novel, through a whatever, in the position of that character, experiencing what they're experiencing, feeling what they're feeling, and that changes you and helps you to recognize that, you know, my life is going to be very different. My past and experiences and what brought me to sit here today with you are very, very different than everyone else's. And yet all of us are equally valid. All of us have amazing and wonderful stories to tell. And that diversity of human experience, how else can you get it but through literature?
So I'll bring up a couple points just to keep pressing on this just to see your opinion. So one thing is, you know, the publishing industry is a business. So as we said, you know, they seem to be pushing the hero's quest and certain ideas. So do we have as much diversity of thought as we can, because it's dependent on this small group of people who decide? And also readers, you know, we were earlier talking about, you know, intelligent people, and yet we still have these problems. And so our readers, you know, I would imagine the more cultured, educated, etc., are generally the readers, and yet the people in charge who are doing all the reading are still leading us to the edge. You know, so that's why I ask, is it really, you know, does literature matter if it's just, you know, sort of molded and conforms to, you know?
Okay. So I'm going to attack this a couple of ways.
Okay.
As a pacifist, so the only way that I would attack anything with words. Yes, the publishing industry has huge problems and far too much influence, both in determining what gets past the editor's desk, what gets passed into production, what, you know, all of that. But I would say too, now there are ways in which you can bypass the publishing industry. And I mean, as much as I think the internet hasn't democratized the world in the ways I think we imagined 20 years ago, when it was the Wild West in a lot of ways, and kind of fun and cool, and you could find yourself down rabbit holes. Now you can produce and publish and market outside of those, you know, the publishing industry itself. I still think, though, that fundamentally our need to create and our need to enjoy stories is so vital to our species, like our sense of community. I mean, let's go back to the Epic of Gilgamesh. You know, it's these tablets you can look at that are thousands of years old that tell stories that are still familiar to us because someone wrote them down. And, you know, we want that connection. We want that imaginative and creative. We want someone to blow our minds when we read by showing us things that would never have occurred to us or we would never have thought possible. But I also, you know, I mean, there's been this threat of like books are ending, nobody reads anymore forever. Like, you know, writing was supposed to ruin everything back for Plato and Socrates. And, you know, now we have, you know, there were all these concerns about ebooks and Kindle readers and whether or not people are going to continue reading. And people are still reading. So I guess I want to say, for anyone who is a creative writer, please keep writing. There are people like me that I read as much as I can. I love to find something and that, no, you know, it doesn't matter that no one else is talking about it. That does amazing things. And then it ends up in my classroom and I expose it to my students and they're amazed. And, you know, I think we can't let go of that. You know, we can't let the industries and all these things prevent us from dreaming great things.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I just wanted to, I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Fight the power.
Yeah. So let's talk about the research you did for this book. Did you just consume media and then just kind of write your thoughts and your based on your education, or how did you do it?
So my education is at the intersection of science and literary studies, so environmental humanities. You know, that's one thing that academia does, right? It creates these silos and pretends they don't talk to each other, but in fact, there's interdisciplinary work going on all over the place. But yeah, for me, I read. I don't need to visit archives. I'm writing about super contemporary materials. But I had to read in lots of fields. So climate science, evolutionary theory, philosophy, literature, all sorts of different. I learned all about geoengineering and the fact that there's no legal limitations anywhere in the world. You can just shoot chemicals up into the sky and there's no authority or regulation. I didn't know that. Did you know that?
No.
So I broadly read and then try to make a coherent argument about what these complex, you know, overlapping and entangled issues. And, you know, so climate science has proven that mass extinction events are happening, that climate change is accelerating beyond the worst case scenario. Even a decade ago, we have surpassed all of those, and those sort of, here's our stopping point. We're way past all of that. Climate apocalypses are happening now to millions of people and countless other species. And it felt really important to me to expand those experiences into that empathy that literature forces readers to conceptualize when they engage deeply. And then I read psychology and neuroscience, you know, to figure out why we can't seem to wrap our head around these issues. And then I read every science fiction, post-apocalyptic, apocalypse literature that I could find.
Wow.
I mean, I read everything I could find. Trying to, like you asked, like find something that does something different. And you know, now there's a genre of cli-fi. When I started this, that term hadn't yet been created. But you know, I just kept finding, like I mentioned before, that they have these Edenic pastoral communities that are, recreation of society. Like you said, wash away everybody that's bad and let this little group start again. And that pattern occurred even in climate fiction. And so that's why I did these careful, close readings of the few texts that I found that made different arguments. I didn't, you know.
Yeah, that list. If you have a list of whatever of all those books you came across, that would be awesome to see, to share with people.
Oh, absolutely. There are so much great stuff out there, and not all of it is published by, the corporate presses. There is some fantastic work that's out that you can access and through other avenues and directly paying authors. And I'm not looking for literature in the snooty way. I'm looking for creative approaches to problems and really unique and imaginative ideas about different kinds of futures.
Did you come across anything that that really surprised you?
I think the biggest surprise for me was how fearful people seem to be about cannibalism. I found cannibalism almost everywhere. And so that was something unexpected. In part because I guess I've never really thought about what the big deal is, and that sounds really morbid and strange.
You're ready to eat them up.
Well, like, people already eat meat of all different types of meat, and so one of the things that I think is so fascinating is that cannibalism is another one of these rigid us-them structures, right? I can't eat another human body's flesh unless I've dehumanized it first. But I can't also be a cannibal unless that flesh is human. So it's this paradoxical, like, imbrication of shifting labels. And one of the things I found really fascinating was this collapsing of binaries. This sort of, people tried it, like in The Road again. The father says they're the good guys because they would never eat other people. But when you look carefully through the text, there's a number of times where the source of what their food was aligned with what would have been human flesh. And so unless it was clearly identifiable by, a skull or a particular bone structure, they ate ham a lot. And so it's almost like another form of self-delusion. If you're truly starving and you're on your hero's quest, so you need to survive, and there is no source of food other than other people, why is cannibalism the wrong thing to do? And that's part of why I'm talking about, like, these cultures of human extinction, is the idea of cannibalism, which has been historically, there has not been a culture or civilization or humanoid species that has not cannibalized throughout time. So I just found it fascinating that these characters express so much concern about cannibalism, either of becoming food for a cannibal or of becoming a cannibal themselves. And so that was a bizarre realization that, like, either the practical matters of hunger mean that you eat what is available.
And I'm going to ask this question, which might sound odd, but after you answer it, I'll explain to you why I asked it. Did you come across many instances of people eating dogs?
Actually, no. There were only 2 dogs that I recall, at least by the time I'd winnowed down. One barks but then vanishes, so we don't know if it was eaten, but the implication is that it was eaten. And the other is the companion for this last human survivor until he dies. And so, which is another, sort of interesting.
And I asked that because I recently came across this very, a Facebook post on a science fiction or fantasy website where people asked about, horror, where dogs are not eaten but hurt or killed or whatever, and harm to dogs seems to really anger people even more than the idea of eating humans. So the fact that and that's part of the So again, I can go back to the publishing industry and human, what readers do and don't want to see. It's like eating dogs is not allowed, even though obviously dogs will get eaten like mad in an
Yeah.
apocalyptic event. So
Yeah. I mean, I figure if something happens, our cats will eat us.
mhm.
But you know,
and, and so
dogs. But see, and that's that dogs as our first sort of we've co domesticated each other, right? Wolves and
mhm,
humans co-domesticated each other. So that, but that's again that's a very Western notion
mhm,
because dogs are food in some countries.
mhm,
And so that's again that privileging of the Western perspective.
mhm,
Um, you know, what people foods are deeply personal, cultural. I mean, think about all the memories and connections with other people and community and sense of belonging that occurs around foods.
mhm.
So, but that's interesting that people objected to dogs on that Facebook page. It's,
Yeah, but I noticed it throughout, just looking through all the stuff I've read. You never see like that when a dog is hurt or badly, when someone purposefully does something, it's almost like writers have gone too far. Like they've crossed the line or they're really like pushing it, you know. Um, but again, cannibalism is horror for people, but not as horrible. So, um, anyway.
you're right. I think it's really interesting because now that I think about it, the dog that died in this novel I'm talking about in the Dog Stars died of old age.
Mhm,
And then there was this grieving process and the burial. So it was a very, appropriately respectful treatment according to those standards that you're talking about.
mhm. And just to think,
Mm.
with climate change and climate refugees, it's like people's pets still get more sympathy than actual human beings. So, you know,
Yeah.
um, so what, was there anything, that you were trying to figure out as you did this work? Any question that you really wanted to get an answer to or try to come to some conclusion you still feel like you haven't gotten there or maybe you have in a sense?
No, I think, I mean, this is one of the ways in which I was really fortunate
Mhm,
because I wasn't under pressure to write this book for any reason other than my own.
mhm,
And so I got to say and do in it things that I think allowed me to concisely, but also persuasively argue. And I feel like it's kind of a good done
okay.
argument. I do know that's a privilege though, and that a lot of academic writing is done under different conditions, and
Mm,
there's stress of getting a job or getting tenure or getting promoted, and um, this was me. I wanted to work it out, and I really do feel like the answer is that human exceptionalism in the Western tradition, and you know getting around that and finding greater community, greater resilience, and greater compassion.
did you have any trouble, well, it sounds like you didn't, but did you have any trouble getting the book finished or published?
Um, well, finished, but mostly just because that's the writing process is hard for everyone, I think, and you know, it took longer than it should have.
Hmm,
I started it more than a decade ago, and I had trying to keep it up to date as far as the fundamental science research was a challenge.
mhm,
And then I had some personal reasons for delay, but you know, it's pressing, and I had absolutely no trouble with the publishing. And in fact, I think the proposal was, they requested the full manuscript 24 hours after I sent an interest query. And I was really impressed with the Bloomsbury editors and peer reviewers. I mean, that process went incredibly fast. I think it went from query to book in 14 months, maybe, which is in the academic press is lightning fast. My experience with them was great. But again, it's freeing to not be writing it for other reasons, right? I wrote it for no other reason than I wanted to. And I wanted to say these things, and I wanted to prove that this was a valid argument. And I think that frees up a lot of the pressures.
Yeah. What do you, well, you did allude to what your current writing project is or might be. Are you working on something now?
I'm thinking a lot about it. And it might just be an excuse to get back to reading all those books. I mean, you focus with such intensity, like this microscopic gaze on the things you're doing in a project. And so there's all this other exciting things I want to get back to reading. I am working on an article, the 50th anniversary issue of the journal Women's Studies is on a thematic, that's my key, is on the theme of what matters most. And Blue is apparently saying dinner matters most. But so I'm working on an article for that. And then I'm thinking some more about this other stuff. Yeah.
I think you should tell Blue that inside voice is better in this instance.
That's why I say cats are going to get us in the end.
Yeah. So where do you have a website or social media where people can follow you online?
I do have a Google Scholar page, but I don't have a lot of social media presence. And I probably should, but my contact information's on the Google Scholar. So if anyone wants to reach out, I'm available through there. And but yeah, I'm behind the times.
Well, I guess, and people can find information about the book on Amazon and Bloomsbury Academic website. So, so what do you hope the book will do then for readers?
I hope it will create species humility. So that on the cover is a skull, and if you can see, there's a wasp on top of the skull. So there's a species of wasp that can photosynthesize. And one of the things I talk about in the conclusion is that true humility involves imagining what comes next. If this is the 6th grade extinction, after every extinction event, there has been new life. It always will. So what might be the next charismatic megafauna? And it may be that thinking a little differently would enable us to mobilize and really transform the way that we are allowing our politicians and our corporate overlords and our various industries and social factors that prevent us from mitigating climate change in any meaningful way.
Yeah. I would love to see I'd love to see that sort of effect. Are there a lot of people? I imagine it's not many people writing on this subject. Have you found others studying it like you are?
I haven't. I mean, there's a lot of people who look at climate fiction and who look at post-apocalyptic fiction and who look at Anthropocene fiction. But often they're looking at, some of them are purposefully looking just at happy endings, those that inspire hope. So this is definitely outside of the norm in terms of really emphasizing the potentiality of human extinction. But there is a field that's called extinction studies. And I am certain there will be, in the next few years, a big explosion in works coming out that are talking about whether it's other non-human species, but the effects of the current extinction events.
Okay.
But to my knowledge, this is the first work that puts humans in that extinction event.
Yeah. I shouldn't smile. I'm smiling at the idea that we can explore stuff like this, not like, oh, that sounds good. Yeah, I'm a big fan of intellectual exploration and that sort of thing.
Well, and remember, when you're thinking about the impact of literature, that philosophy always asks the questions first, and then science gets to work. And philosophy is often where literature comes to life, right? Where our literature, I'm sorry, that was backwards. Literature is often where philosophy comes to life, where we can imagine those things that philosophers might be pondering, but we can actually take them out and put them out in the world, give them life, give them experience. And so, I think it's vitally important.
Have you heard of the concept? I think it's kind of well known. Just the idea that we had thousands of years to develop our philosophy and ethics about the technology we were creating. That it developed slowly over time, but now it's going so quickly. We haven't had the time to develop the philosophy and ethics to handle our new technologies. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the, we fear the singularity, right? The moment where like artificial intelligence surpasses, and I'm not sure that it hasn't already. With the data mining and the ways in which our movements around the internet are not anonymous and not private. And I mean, that's part of the problem, where you've got in the United States Congress, people asking questions of, Facebook's founder and Twitter's founder that don't make sense, that because they don't understand the fundamental structure of these systems. But I mean, are we past the point of no return? I don't know.
That's the scary question. Well, that's all the questions I have. Do you have any parting thoughts or words?
No, I really want to thank you for the opportunity to meet with you and talk about my book. And I appreciate it, because I think often we write academically and assume that, 3 people like my mother, are gonna care. And it's so I think that same concern you have about whether or not literature matters, I think we all have that too.
Yeah. I like to play devil's advocate just to tease out ideas. So thank you very much for taking the time to speak with me.
Thank you so much, Cris.
In the next episode, I speak to Amanda Ann Klein about her study of reality TV shows on MTV. Hit the subscribe button to catch that episode. Thank you for watching this video version of Full Contact Nerd Interviews. If you liked the episode, please subscribe and hit the like button. If you'd like more book suggestions or information on fiction and storytelling, including sci-fi, horror, fantasy, mysteries, thrillers, film history, gaming, and more, please check out my podcast, Full Contact Nerd Interviews, my YouTube channel, Cris Alvarez Full Contact Nerd, and my webpage, crisalvarez.com or fullcontactnerd.com. If you're looking for military history and general history, including true crime, please check out my YouTube channel, War Scholar, my podcast, Military History Inside Out, and my webpage, warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com. If you're looking for space history and the science, technology, and business of space, check out my YouTube channel, Spacewalks Money Talks, my podcast, Technology in Space, and my website, technologyandspace.com. Thank you for watching, and keep imagining the past, the present, and the future.